Today's webinar is entitled An Introduction to the Scholars Gallery of the Asian Civilisations Museum in Singapore. And this is the second of the Arts Committee series of presentations intended to feature Japanese and Asia art collections located outside of Japan. If you haven't been to the Asian Civilisations Museum, it's a wonderful museum in Singapore, and certainly a place you should try to visit when you pass through. Our speaker today is Patricia Welch, who is a retired professional engaged in independent research, writing and publishing of articles in educating docents, students, and anyone interested in Asian history and religion and their related arts. Ms. Welch is also currently a senior docent and docent trainer in the Asian Civilization Museum in Singapore. Ms. Welch has a degree in Chinese from the University of Oslo in Norway and an MA in Asian Studies from Boston University, where she was a lecturer in her early years. She also has an interesting background in the business area. She has a business degree and worked in senior international marketing positions for a number of multinational companies, including McKinsey & Company, Time Magazine Group, ABN AMRO Bank, Pearson UK, and American Express, until retiring to return to her original passion, which is Asian art history. Ms. Welch has published 3 books. My favorite is Chinese Art, A Guide to Motifs and Visual Imagery, which I recommend to all of you. I keep this book on my iPad as a reference book whenever I go to visit a museum, because in the various ceramic and other pieces you can see the motifs, and you'll often want to look up what the actual meaning embedded in the art is. She's also written The Chinese New Year and A History of Southeast Asian Ceramic Society, as well as numerous other papers. Ceramics is one of her passions, and she has recently stepped down as the president of the Southeast Asian Ceramic Society, which continues to serve on its council. Patricia was born in the United States, but has lived for long periods of time in Norway and Hong Kong, and currently resides in Bangkok and Singapore. She also spent a semester as a student at Joji Dainaku in Tokyo during the 1980s. And with that, I will turn the microphone over to Patricia for today's webinar.
Thank you very much, Chris, for that very nice introduction. Good morning, everyone. Let me just start my program and we'll begin. For the last 15 years, as you heard, I've been working with and training the docents at Singapore's Asian Civilisations Museum, affectionately known as ACM. So today, I'd like you to imagine yourselves visitors to the museum, where it will be my privilege to take you on a typical docent's tour of our Scholars Gallery. 30 years ago, when Singapore decided to devolve its national museum into 3 separate institutions, one of the buildings requisitioned was a grand colonial structure that used to house a number of government offices. It had been built in 1867 on the banks of the Singapore River, on the far side of Cavenagh Bridge, which you see here and which still stands today. It was and is still known as the Empress Place building. Here you see the area from the air, with the museum directly underneath the white arrow, tucked into a section of downtown Singapore that's been left as a historic district. It's the 2nd oldest building still standing in Singapore. All the orange roofed buildings you see are now conservation buildings. Directly to the right of the museum is the Arts House, which has a small cinema and exhibition rooms, then the Parliament and the Victoria Theatre and Concert Hall. The large green field is partly owned by the Singapore Cricket Club, but also serves as Singapore's historic padang or parade ground. The building with the dome to the right of the padang used to be Singapore's Supreme Court, but has now been turned into a marvelous, huge new National Arts Museum focusing on Southeast Asian art. And the building to the far right you see with what looks like a UFO on its roof is Singapore's new Supreme Court building. The Empress Place building opened as the ACM in 2003 after extensive refurbishing. At first, its focus was on the Asian cultures that contributed to Singapore's history, which meant China, Southeast Asia, and India. But for the past 3 years, it's been slowly evolving, taking a more thematic approach, drawing on Singapore's historic role as a cosmopolitan, multicultural, multi-religious trading hub and port city. One of the changes was the deconstruction of our former history-focused China gallery. So I'm afraid if you've seen this gallery, you won't find it when you return. As a result, the subject matter of this original gallery has now been distributed across several galleries. Our new Scholars Gallery, I'm going to take you through, a trade gallery, a textiles gallery, and directly a floor above, the museum's Chinese ceramics collection, with representative ceramics from the Neolithic to the late 1900s, including the museum's world-famous Derhua or Blanc de Chine collection, considered one of the most extensive in the world. We also have a small but very good Japanese ceramic collection given to us by Mr. and Mrs. Toshio Egawa, former residents of Singapore. But those wares are primarily on display in our new trade gallery. The purpose of this new Scholars Gallery, according to our museum director, Kenny Ting, is to explore Chinese systems of belief, philosophy, and ritual, some of it derived from Confucian ideas of propriety, through presentation of the courtly arts and objects collected and admired by scholars of that literati tradition, and also to reveal the taste and pursuits of scholars and those who would emulate them. In other words, the merchants or the nouveau riche. There are 2 entrances to the new Scholars Gallery. One is from an ancestors and ritual gallery, what used to be the Southeast Asian gallery. But the second, and the route that I like to take visitors through, is a very new, low-lit Christian art gallery. By this route, the last displays you glimpse before crossing into the Scholars Gallery are 2 showcases, one of which displays an impressive array of Nestorian crosses on loan from Hong Kong University. These small cookie cutter in appearance bronzes are about 4 to 5 centimeters in diameter and date from the 13th century Yuan dynasty. Their religious and decorative motifs have made scholars identify them as Nestorian Christian, a sect that Marco Polo described having met members of during his travels in China in the 13th century. Most were found across sites in southern Mongolia in the early 20th century by a British resident of Beijing who found them rather amusing and collected them, and later donated them to the Hong Kong Museum. The second showcase brings you to a rubbing of the famous Beilin stele, erected in Xi'an in 781, commemorating the 7th century entry of Nestorian Christianity into Tang, China, during the reign of the Emperor Taizong. Here you see the original stele with one of the trainee docents I took to Xi'an last October. Pass through the connecting door out of the Christian Art Gallery and cross the short footbridge that links the old building with the new wing, and you enter a space that is so light and airy. The gallery so simple yet elegantly designed with a light oak floor and natural light, so surprising after the solemn darkness of the Christian Art Gallery, that it's immediately reminiscent to most visitors of the calm atmosphere of a Confucian scholars' retreat. Although there's no thatched roof pavilion by a lake edge, it is a space that beckons visitors to really study and contemplate the physical and mental world of China's lost scholar elites, who lived in a world once defined as a cultured idleness. The 12th century scholar Zhao Shigu would have been delighted by the gallery's contents, as they appear plucked from the treatise in which he organized desirable collectibles into 10 categories. The motivation to accumulate or collect such desirable effects was thus set in motion amongst China's scholar elites. The artifacts he selected had one inescapable prerequisite, and that was elegance. That which is elegant, is to be welcomed. while that which could have been considered vulgar or common, su, was to be shunned. But as all students of Chinese connoisseurship eventually learn, it's a combination of factors that lead to the identification of certain artifacts as being worthy of a scholar's studio. It was always a combination of material, form, color, and finishing that determined an object's legitimacy as worthy of literati attention. Happily for visitors, the ACM Gallery has kept its focus on artifacts that were most likely to have been found their way into a scholar's heart. So we'll start with the 4 arts or cultural pursuits considered essential to cultivating and refining one's behavior: music, chess, calligraphy, and painting. What better introduction to a scholar's gallery than a Ming Dynasty blue and white lidded porcelain jar from the Jiajing reign that features the 4 scholarly arts to remind us that the world of the literati was mainly an academic culture based on poetry, painting, and calligraphy. Each one of the 4 sides of the jar represents one of these 4 arts, and the 3 arts that aren't easily seen by visitors are blown up in pictures on the wall behind. Although it's doubtful that this jar would have ever graced a literatus's study, it's an appropriate reminder that art in China was an effective vehicle for conveying ideas and for molding a general ethos of propriety and humility. The depictions of scholars engaged in practicing calligraphy, studying painting, playing the qin, and focusing on the game of chess would have appealed to a broad audience, not limited to scholars alone, but also to affluent Chinese, the literary gentry, and other merchant classes who ate the taste of the literati. And the Confucian-inspired scenes on the jar are complemented by the Taoist 8 trigrams, which you see on the lid. And these are perhaps in recognition of the Emperor Jiajing's aspirations of immortality and his confidence in Taoist rituals and signs. After a failed attempt on his life by 17 court concubines, he was a despised emperor, who attempted to strangle him while at the same time stabbing him with their hairpins, he moved out of the Forbidden City into a nearby palace where he sequestered himself with a select few favorites and a group of Taoist magicians who assured him they could preserve and prolong his life through special Taoist ceremonies, pills, and various exercises. The emperor's belief in Taoism must have been known throughout the empire, inspiring potters to include such Taoist symbols on their works, although this piece was not official court porcelain. And we know this because hidden to visitors, but on the jar's base, is not a rain mark, but a 4-character inscription that reads, Fu Gui Jiaqi, beautiful vessel for the rich and honorable. And most blue and white porcelains with this inscription are folk wares, or what we call minyao, made in China's ceramic capital of Jingdezhen during the Jiajing and the Wanli period, so mid to late 16th century. 2 zithers, or qin, a Kangxi reign zither made of wood and finished in black lacquer, which visitors can spot lying very temptingly on a daybed, as well as on your bottom right, a very charming 19th century lacquered wood chin-shaped ink rest that's only about 6 inches long, represent the cultural pursuit of music. Such instruments were always the symbolic pictorial sign of a scholar. Depictions of scholars inevitably show a young servant hovering nearby, carrying that precious qin, usually wrapped in a piece of silk, in the event his master is suddenly inspired to play. Of course, the vast majority of scholars could at best manage only a few chords. The instrument is notoriously difficult to learn to play well, and takes at least a year just to learn the various hand positions that actually plucks. The 4th approved cultural pursuit was the Chinese game of weiqi, I think better known to you in Japan as Go. It's played with black and white markers on a game board, and our display has been set up to represent a game interrupted midway. Visitors who actually know how to play Go usually recognize that one of our curators is a very proficient Go player himself. And while he's Chinese, He visits Japan every year for annual Go competitions. The game that is known as Weiqi in China and Go in Japan originates in China. It's first mentioned in the 4th century BC manuscript, and scholars believe it traveled to Japan via Korea in the 5th century, reaching Japan in the 7th century. Now, if you look closely at the display case, you'll see displayed alongside is a pair of kangxi, so late 1600s, drum-shaped porcelain containers that hold the captured markers. On the containers are mythical beasts perched on a rock amidst waves. One of the most memorable stories I've read concerning these Weiqi or Go markers, which are very often small, round, shiny stones, is a late Ming tale of a very famous Suzhou courtesan named Du Wei, who committed suicide after the death of her young husband by jumping into a river, holding an antique inkstone of her husband in her left hand and his box of 300 Go pieces in her right to weigh herself down. Moving on to the 4 treasures of the studio: inkstones, ink sticks and cakes, paper, and brushes. It took many years of practice to learn which animal fur made the best brush for the task at hand, as well as which strokes were required to achieve the desired outcome. And this meant that each scholar had to possess a very significant number of brushes, each designed for a specific use. Now, a large number of brushes requires storage containers. And while some brushes were hung vertically from tabletop racks, no scholar's table would have been complete without a brush pot for storing those brushes. Ceramic brush pots, as you see here, appeared in the first quarter of the 17th century during the Ming Dynasty. But by the end of the century, blue and white porcelain brush pots were the rage and were everywhere. And they provided new surfaces for artists to display their painting and calligraphy skills on. This large blue and white Kangxi period brush pot used to be on display in our gallery and depicts a collection of 7 poems by 7 different poets on popular literary themes. It's such a beautiful piece, I wanted to share it with you, even though unfortunately it's been rotated out of the gallery. So the present display shows 3 bamboo or wood brush pots and a porcelain look-alike. Can you guess which one is the porcelain? Starting at the left, if you look very closely, you will just make out 3 figures, and their clothing will identify them to you as representing China's 3 primary schools of thought: Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism. The yellow pot second from the right is made to resemble wooden pots, but it is indeed made out of porcelain. Now, inkstones can be made from a variety of materials: bronze, iron, clay, even porcelain, but the most highly regarded are made of stone and identified by their place of origin. Duan inkstones, of which ACM owns several 19th century examples, thanks to a very, broad collection which was gifted to the museum, come from Zhaoqing in Guangdong province, and it's named after the ancient Duan prefecture that governed the city during the Tang Dynasty. This is my favorite, as it utilizes the stone's natural inclusions by transforming them into the shells of turtles sunbathing on the shore of what will be, after the Literati prepares this ink, a very inky looking pond. This horizontally grained Sunghua stone became very popular during the reign of the Kangxi Emperor, so late 1600s, early 1700s, perhaps because it was closely linked to Kangxi's homelands in the north of China. It's encased in a beautifully carved zitan wooden box, and the design features a fish and a stone chime, which is a Chinese visual pun for an expression, ji qing you yu, which means happiness and abundance. The ACM collection also includes a number of ink and brush rests made of bone, ivory, rock crystal, and porcelain. A natural rock crystal brush rest that dates to the late Ming or early Qing 17th century would have been a real find, as China's scholar gentry were especially fascinated with unusual rocks, and especially one that would have been the perfect size and shape as a brush rest. Furthermore, rock crystal was believed to be petrified water and was prized for its purity and clarity, qualities that made it popular among the literati of imperial China, whose code embraced modesty and integrity. Chinese inkstones were made from mixing animal glue, derived from the boiled skins, bones, and horns of animals, with the soot from burning leaves of wood, and pine soot was considered the best. That was then pressed into forms. And one of the practices that marked the rise of an elite class during the Ming Dynasty was the conversion of previously utilitarian objects into objects of amusement, including the manufacture of ink sticks and cakes, which became, at its very top end, a luxury business. These molded sets were very popular gifts and so often decorated with gold or silver gilt. This is an incredible set of 22 ink sticks decorated in gold, depicting silk making, and it's based on images from a very classic text, the Gengji Tu, which were pictures of farming and weaving. And one of the ink sticks even carries the mark of a very famous Qing dynasty ink maker. So we exhibited this set last year when we had a fashion exhibition of Guo Pei's fashion. She's one of China's leading contemporary fashion designers. Ironically, the prescribed treasures of the studio list is missing a very important category essential to every studio, which is water containers. No amount of ink and brush is going anywhere without water. And water is what makes the difference in a brush stroke that creates a hibernating branch in the winter with a dry stroke from a budding branch in the summer, which requires a wet stroke. So large water storage containers were found in every studio. Their mouths had to be large enough to handle the water ladle used to fill the smaller water pots and brush washers that sat on the scholar's writing table. So amongst our gallery's collection of tabletop water containers is this winsome beehive-shaped peach bloom glaze water dropper. It's one of the 8 traditional shapes associated with this glaze from the Kangxi area. Happily, our ACM pot has the obligatory 3-character rain mark on the underside. And the shape of this pot suggests it's more likely used for shaping a brush's tip and removing excess ink, however, than a pot that would have been used for washing one's brush. The delicate leaf-shaped porcelain example on the left is my favorite brush washer in our collection. I can just picture the potter who made it possibly having picked up a leaf on his way to work one morning, putting it on a table, and then very, very carefully constructing this beautiful nature-inspired piece from it. There's a picture of the rain mark on the bottom of the Kangxi pot. To see our museum's elegant Xuande period blue and white brush washer featuring a 5-clawed dragon, you'll have to visit the museum's newly opened ceramics gallery upstairs. It was moved there because it was during the Xuande period that rain marks began to be used regularly on Chinese ceramics. He was a great patron of the arts. Unfortunately, this piece was locked away in the display case with our curator on vacation, so I couldn't take a picture of the rain mark for you. Brush wrist and ink rests aren't included in the 4 treasures of the studio, but few studios would have been found without them. While a particularly delicate 18th century bone and ivory inkstand decorated with hornless dragons isn't the obvious material choice on which to rest a wet ink stick, at least not in my home, its beauty cannot be denied. Either it had a very careful owner, or perhaps there was an easier to clean jade or porcelain surrogate nearby. Its open work surface is very reminiscent of the style known as linglung, that pierced work that we find in porcelain that was regarded as a literary luxury during the Ming Dynasty. Now, one of the 4 happinesses, according to Chinese tradition, is encountering an old friend in a foreign place. And for many museum goers, this can also be said of spotting a familiar artifact in a new museum. ACM's brush rest might be just one such old friend for visitors. It was for me when I joined the museum. One can only guess at how many of these very recognizable, thickly potted brush rests made during the reign of the Zhengde Emperor, who reigned from 1506 to 1521, exist. It was made in China's famous porcelain city of Jingdezhen. The brush rest has 5 scalloped peaks that represent China's 5 sacred mountains, very popular motif in Chinese art. And although the details may vary slightly, most feature sprays of lingzhi, which is a fungus believed to have had magical powers, and 2 cursive Arabic inscriptions in Persian script inside a lozenge on each side of the brush rest. The inscription on one side reads Kama, which means pen, and on the other side, Dan, which means holder. The British museum expert Jessica Harrison Hall believes that these were mostly made for Muslim administrators at the Chinese court. And she says this because few have been found in West Asian collections. But at least one scholar has proposed that they may simply have just been fashionable, the sort of frisson of that exotic script adding to the object's allure. And this emperor was particularly known for his interest in foreign objects. But any Middle Eastern legacy that this emperor might have left on the court was quickly trounced by his successor, the Jia emperor, who I've already introduced to you, who was the devout Taoist. He removed any evidence of West Asia from the court. Another revered mountain form that would have brought thoughts, I think, of nature and renewal to most scholars are these scholar rocks. They were immensely popular amongst the literati, as they were said to possess the same qualities as those most respected in calligraphy, as well as stimulating the viewer's imagination. As early as the Tang dynasty, so 618 to 907, literati had identified 4 aesthetic criteria, and this scholar's rock has all 4. It shows signs of thinness, openness, translucence, and wrinkling, and would have fallen into that category of rocks reminiscent of a Taoist fairy grotto or a miniature mountain form. Not all of our visitors see what the literati actually saw in them, but last year I had a young man, I would say in his mid-20s, and he said to me at the end of introducing this object, he said, "I get it, mental rock climbing." One of the display cases visitors enjoy most shows a miscellany of small collectibles, including carvings of Buddhist saints and snuff bottles. My favorites are this bright red porcelain miniature of a capsicum, an 18th century boxwood Rui scepter, bottom left, in the bright, beautiful polished wood in the form of a gnarled fungus. This was used as an aid in Buddhist teaching or dialogue. It was called pure talk. But by the 18th century, it had become an essential item in most Chinese marriage ceremonies. And on the bottom right, you see a carved soapstone figure of a Lohan. This is a disciple of the Buddha who's attained enlightenment. And if you see in his left hand, he's holding a Rui scepter. In Buddhism, the master who holds this, it designates that he is the master and has the final words or interpretation on the Buddhist text that's being studied. And in the delicate upper left-hand corner, you see a late 17th century Derwa or Blanc de Chine brush washer, which I think you have to agree is the embodiment of elegance or ya. This could grace anyone's table. It is, however, this wood-based lacquer screen, which dates to the Qianlong period, that attracts a majority of our visitors. It's superbly carved. It depicts one of China's best-known yaji, or elegant gatherings. And any scholar wealthy enough to have owned it would have been the envy of his circle, but more likely imperially connected. The host of the event was China's most famous calligrapher, Wang Shizhi, who lived in the 4th century, whose beautiful brushwork was inspired by watching how geese moved their necks. In the year 353, Wang Shizhi invited 41 of the greatest calligraphers and poets in China for an elegant gathering, and it's this event that's commemorated in the lacquer screen. There are 3 layers of lacquer, red, green, and ochre, and they're all distinguishable, each with a different, intricately carved diaper pattern to represent the 3-dimensional landscape. This was an innovation that was begun in the 13th century during the Yuan dynasty. And if you can imagine the years it would have taken to lay up all these various layers of lacquer, because as you know, each layer has to dry for a very long, prolonged period at a very slow pace. And the depth, and then actually taking that knife in hand to carve through the different layers and not hit the wrong layer, it would have taken a real genius. There are many, many stories associated with this famous event, but the most famous surrounds the manuscript that resulted from the event that Wang Shizhi recorded, with a weasel hair brush to accompany the 37 poems written by 26 of his guests. It was said to have been so beautifully written that it became empire famous, and so desirable was this manuscript that the Tang Emperor Taizong used trickery to steal the famous work from the monk who had acquired it from one of Wang's descendants. And then, as the story goes, he had the document buried with him in his mausoleum, lost to the world forever. A small selection of ancient bronzes from the Shang to the Western Han from the museum's collections is also on display, a reminder of the respect with which they were held and collected by scholars. And they are complemented by a small display of ceramic copies. The most important pieces of furniture is a scholar's studio, and it always would have included a painting table, a day bed, and shelving for books and collectibles. This very elegant 19th century Ming-style daybed from Fujian is made of Lungyan wood, and it has both back and side railings with indented corners, bulging legs, and horse hoof feet. It was most likely made in the south, as Lungyan trees were cultivated for their fruit and flourished in China's Fujian province. The discovery, unfortunately, in the 18th century that its beautiful grain made it a desirable material for furniture making nearly decimated the region's orchards. It contrasts very starkly with this other daybed in our gallery, which also usually stops visitors. It's an 1875 classic opium bed. Now, although daybeds were meant to serve multiple purposes, from providing room for meditation, reading, relaxing, appreciating art, studying books, serving tea, and spreading out paintings to entertaining guests, the size alone of this one stops most visitors in their tracks, and you can see it dominates a large part of one end of the gallery. To be honest, its size and ornate decorations depicting scenes from well-known stories, right down to its ornately carved lion-dog leg supports, seem alarmingly out of place in the Scholars Gallery. But it's a very important piece in our Singapore collection because it's most likely from Chaozhou, and thus would have seemed very grand to the Chaozhou merchant diaspora in Southeast Asia. A true literatist in China would have dismissed it as guanqiao, which means over the top, but visitors love it, and the gallery guards have to keep a careful watch because all the children who visit are just dying to crawl up onto it. Southeast Asia was one of several geographic areas that benefited from and was strongly influenced by the Chinese diaspora. So by including examples of regional furniture in the gallery, such as this opulent daybed and some of the other furniture you can see in the background that's made from southern wood that was exported throughout Southeast Asia, we're trying to show visitors how traditions adapt to new environments in terms of both materials and style. And one of the ambitions of our current director of the museum is to focus more on what he calls Asian antiquities and decorative art to show maritime history and the trade that actually operated throughout the region. And to this end, we've added a whole bunch of new gallery and display cases that show not just decorative arts, but now include things like guns, opium artifacts, trade elements, etc. You can see on the far right that completing a scholar's study, there would have been paintings and calligraphy, usually in the form of hanging scrolls, because they're very efficient vehicles of poetry, calligraphy, and painting. So our gallery rotates a selection from its collection on a regular basis. Other items in the gallery are rotated periodically, and they include examples of rank and festival badges, court accessories, including hats and beads, as well as other possessions a court official or a nouveau riche literatus might have owned. An example is this exquisite 18th or 19th century black lacquered box inlaid with mother of pearl in the shape of two ribbon-tied scrolls resting on two albums of paintings. And the thousands of inlaid pieces of mother of pearl give the perfect illusion of brocade. Many of our visitors, because one can't approach this particular box too close, assume that it's Japanese when we show it to them, but it's not, it's made in China. And here, I'm going to bid you farewell and welcome you to the museum. We have free daily tours for visitors in English and several times a week, also in Korean, French, Japanese, and Spanish. So thank you for joining our tour today. And if you'd like to write me or ask me any questions, I've included my email at the bottom of this closing slide. Thank you.
Okay, Patricia, if you could turn on your video as soon as you're ready. Thank you very much. I hope everyone will join me in a virtual applause for that wonderful presentation. It was really interesting. Can you tell us, Patricia, how long will this exhibition be on, and when did it open? Is it just now that it's open?
No, this gallery actually opened about 2 years ago, and we rotate a number of the artifacts on a regular basis. For example, I just discovered last week that those paintings on the side have been rotated out, and instead we're showing 20 letters, which record significant Chinese historical events and different styles of calligraphy on the side. So it's a surprise for us as when I'm training the docents, I always tell them, make sure you do a walkthrough before you lead a group on tour, because you never know what's going to be changed overnight. But
who makes a decision on the changes?
The director of the museum, together with two curators, a senior curator and a junior curator. And they do consult us, but sometimes it's just a matter of somebody notices that something needs to be cleaned, or a new gift has been made to the museum and they want to put it on display. But most of these artifacts are on permanent display, and just a few of them will be rotated in and out. So it's always worth going back and visiting, even if you visited 6 months before. And the docents vary. I encourage every docent to work up their own little tour. So everyone has different stories. You visit that gallery and you'll have a different tour from a different one of my docents.
Yes, and the museum, I would say, is incredibly accessible if you visit Singapore, because it's right across from the Fullerton, I think. I mean, I've stayed in the Fullerton Hotel and walked across. It's probably a 5-minute walk, 4 minutes.
4 minutes.
And it's a for even on a business trip to Singapore, this is a wonderful museum to go to, because it doesn't, you can go there for 30 minutes, you can go there for 4 hours. You probably 4 hours, you get more out of it, but I like to visit it anyway. And it has a nice little museum shop as well in the downstairs in the front, where there's.
And it now has a very, very nice Chinese restaurant attached. It's too nice, because we get all of the business people from the other side of the river who are now coming over to our museum restaurant. It's become very popular. It has one of the best dim sum lunches, I think, in all of Singapore, very reasonably priced.
Really, is that the one that's has partly outside?
It had an outside table,
dining?
but it changed 2 years ago when the new museum opened with the new galleries. So the old one used to be Southeast Asian, and the new one is called Empress, just the Empress. And it's just Chinese food, very elegantly served, very nice. Okay. Highly recommended to you, Chris.
Yeah. Well, I don't know when I'm coming back to Singapore soon, but I hope it's soon. I like to go back there. You had mentioned right at the beginning of the presentation, Nestorian Christianity, which I think dates from the 7th century and continued to the 13th, which is, pretty long, 600 years. But I assume that's all gone in China. And when you say the ends in the 13th century, that's another 600 years or 700 years till now. And do you have any idea, can you tell us something about that? I mean, why did it disappear? And it's fascinating that there's actually relics of it now drifting around in museums, etc.
Yeah, it came in obviously over the Silk Road, the land Silk Road from West Asia. It seemed to take the attention of the northern tribal groups. So it was mainly those Mongolians and the tribes to the north who adopted the religion. It was interesting when the Jesuit priests arrived in the 1700s, they kept meeting people who said, oh yes, I have met people with the same beliefs, you know, when I was traveling through the northern regions. So there was this long belief by the Jesuits that they just had to find that lost Christian community and reinstate it. But it was pretty much dead. They had the artifacts, but they really had no idea left of the theology by then. The whole history of Christianity is so interesting because it's just, Christianity in the last 20 years has just taken off again in China. And I've been amazed at the number of new churches, and they call them town churches or private churches that have sprung up in people's basements and homes. And 20 years ago was when the Communist Party put out an article called Article 19. And they allowed religion to once more be practiced. And they rebuilt all these Buddhist and Confucian temples by design to give the people a sense of something to believe in the old traditions. But they're very carefully regulated. So you have this history of first the Catholic missionaries coming in the very early years, converting some, but not many, because the whole idea that you needed a priest to maintain the ceremonies meant that the congregation, when the priests were evicted from China, the religion died. Then the Protestant missionaries came in the 1800s, and because they had lay members actually leading services, etc., that endured somewhat till 1949. But there were always underground groups, like there were in Japan. And then you have this late new movement, and it's an amazing amount of the population, they say now, has now converted back to Christianity, but very underground forms. There's accepted Christianity, mainly Catholic in the cities, but then there are all these underground Protestant and sort of new wave movements. So yes, Nestorianism sort of kept the flame, not the flame, but maybe the coals burning in the background.
Yeah, I mean, the irony is Nestorian Christianity itself is from the Catholic point of view, was a rejected,
yes,
schismatic religion.
absolutely.
And it drifted east, I guess, is the best way to put it. And so it's fascinating. It contrasts greatly with the later Catholic and Christian influence coming in, Matteo Ricci and all of that in the 16th century, which was all coastal, not from the interior.
Yeah, and they targeted the literati. They thought the best way to convert was top down, which they wasn't.
Right. Well, I think that there's an argument that they assisted in the suppression of Nestorianism too.
Yes, definitely.
I mean, they didn't recognize that when they came. But can you say, you told us the story of the Jiajing emperor's attempted assassination by his concubines. That's a fascinating story. Can you say something more about that?
He was very much disliked. He was very vain and a very difficult ruler and had a bad temper. And so 17 of his concubines decided to assassinate him by strangling him with a silk cord and their hairpins. And they surprised him one night in his bedchamber. But unfortunately, nobody knew how to tie the proper knot. And when he actually wasn't choking, and their hairpins, because they were gold and very soft metal, were bending instead of piercing his heart and chest, one of the concubines became afraid, and she ran and told the empress that her son was under attack. And she came and with the guards, and the whole thing was stopped. And all 17 of the concubines, including the one who gave away the story, were executed.
Oh,
and that terrified him so much. Next to the Forbidden City, and today it's the enclave. If you stand in front of the Forbidden City and look to the west, to your left, there is a beautiful parked-in area with houses and a big gate. And that's where the senior communist members official live. Well, that's where Jiajing moved. It had been the former residence of a prince. And he moved in there and built several pleasure houses and gardens and bridges around the 3 little lakes. And then he basically shut himself in. You weren't allowed in. It was sort of like Trump's White House. You weren't allowed in unless you'd been screened and tested and interviewed. And he was very protective of his health. And then he brought in all of these magicians. And he kept himself to just 1 or 2 concubines after that. He dismissed all the rest as being untrustworthy.
What was the date of that? When would that have been?
Judging, he's 1522 to
I
1566.
see. Okay. So in Chinese terms, relatively modern, but in our Western terms, quite a while ago.
Yes, yes. And of course, as soon as he died, his successor immediately wiped out all signs of Taoism. He was one of the only 2 emperors during the Ming took up Taoism as a practicing religion. Most were Confucians.
Were there any Buddhist emperors from that period, or?
All were technically Buddhist. They all saw themselves as supporters of Buddhism. So all in name at least protected or supported Buddhism, gave money to temples and supported monasteries, etc. But not as avidly as it was supported during the Tang Dynasty, for example, or the Qing, which came later.
So we have a question from Glenn Fukushima coming in on the Q&A about how many pieces in the collection are there, and are you now acquiring new pieces?
Oh, I have to say I have no idea. I go through, we have a beautiful heritage conservation center that we take our trainees through, and it's just, it's huge. There's just thousands and thousands of pieces. I mean, there's even things, like horse and buggy carriages from the colonial period in the conservation center. I really have no idea how many pieces we have in the collection, but we are constantly being gifted collections, being loaned. We have a beautiful collection of Chinese textiles on loan to us from the Chris Hall collection in Hong Kong. He has one of the largest collections of Chinese textiles in the world. Just beautiful textiles, and like the Igawa gift that we received, beautiful collection of Japanese ceramics and other ceramics as well, some Chinese ceramics. So most of the ink and paint, the calligraphy materials were a gift from another foundation.
And so are you acquiring, or, I mean, most of the, it's not there's no budget to acquire, it's actually through donations, is that right?
There is a budget to acquire, and I'll tell you one of the tricks. Whenever we hear that the museum has acquired a new piece, we all run to our latest Sotheby's catalogs, because inevitably it's been purchased. So we're all curious. Oh, that piece of Gandharan silver. Oh, okay, that was 12,000 pounds or something in last month's auction. Yes, there is a budget, but a lot of the collection has been built through gifts, through donations. Yeah.
Does Singapore have like a charitable deduction for that sort of thing? I mean, is there an estate, as part of an estate, to make a donation will have a benefit for that, which encourages?
Big benefit. It's either 4 or 5 times the value of the donation you get as a tax write-off. So there's a huge.
Really?
Oh, yes. And it caused a terrible scandal some years back when a donation was made, and the government questioned the value of that donation. And it turned out, when they consulted other valuators, that it was probably overvalued by 4 or 5 times. So the breath of scandal, of course, swept across Singapore, and the donation was retrieved by the family, and everything was sort of quieted down. So it's now very serious. A donation is made, the evaluation is quite proper, but there's a very large tax benefit, yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about the auction system in Singapore? Is there an active, I mean, Sotheby's and Bonhams and these others, do they have an active?
No longer, unfortunately. We used to have offices for all of them, but about 4 or 5 years ago, they all relocated to Hong Kong. Most of the people who participated in the auctions here in Singapore came from either China or Hong Kong or Jakarta. And there's a lot of money, a lot of auction money coming from Jakarta. And they decided finally that Hong Kong was a more central venue. We do have exhibitions when they have large auctions in Hong Kong. They'll stop in Singapore and we'll have a 2 or 3 day weekend viewing of
And
select.
are there now active collectors in Singapore as well?
Oh yes, very active collectors, but very discreet, very hard to know who they are. It's very word of mouth, very closed.
And what do they collect? I mean, what's fashionable in Singapore now in terms of collections?
Still ceramics, Chinese ceramics by far, and we do have some excellent dealers here with pieces where Hong Kong has really just been sort of wiped clean of antiques. But Singapore, when I first moved here 25 years ago, it was the place to buy antiques, and especially antique Chinese furniture, which came in over the land route from Western China and Tibet. You could buy Tibetan chests. You had your choice of hundreds of Tibetan chests for a while. There are fewer pieces now, but we still have, I would say, 5 really top quality antique shops in Singapore. Worth a trip if you're a collector. And they paintings and calligraphy, of course.
And the people who buy those, let's just take the furniture as an example. And I think this, there was a heyday of buying that kind of furniture, really great Ming Dynasty pieces and mid-Qing Dynasty pieces, Huang Hali type furniture in, I guess I would say, when I was a child, there were things in Hong Kong. I remember as this is now in the early 1970s, that period through about 2000. But then, there was a lot more production in the mainland, and you would know if you're buying furniture whether it was an antique or not. But there were just a huge. So now we don't have any of that because as you had mentioned, the trees have all gone. I mean, all the northern Burma and South China hardwood furniture it's now coming from Africa, that wood, if it's being made at all. So, but is that Singapore is a limited place. I mean, all of that furniture went into houses in Singapore. Is that right?
Yes, but it was also boom years for expats in Singapore in the 80s and 90s, and they had the money and they had the time to do the shopping, and a lot of it went back to Europe and the West, unfortunately, as families relocated. We saw some incredible collections that had been, compiled during those years leave. So I would say keep an eye on those antique shops now. In the UK, still, my husband and I still find some amazing things, especially country sales in the UK.
Really? Okay.
Yes. Hawaii also has some very good Chinese antique shops. One of the most amazing things I saw in the mid 1980s when I was living in Hong Kong is I saw a client of Hong Kong Bank in Macau. And I accompanied one of the Hong Kong Bank people, and it was a huge warehouse, and the whole Hong Kong was lending it money, and the warehouse was full of antique Chinese furniture that was broken, and they were very carefully taking all these pieces apart and reconstructing new antiques, and it was overwhelming. It was huge, and the workmanship they did was amazing, and that was in Macau back in the 80s.
Does that still exist?
I'm sure it's all gone now. I'm sure.
Okay.
Just like here.
I have some pieces from my parents that I'm looking to fix.
Oh, so. You are very lucky. Oh, we have people here in Singapore who will do repairs on antique Chinese furniture.
So we have another question. Can you tell us about art education in Singapore, especially for the younger age group?
It was not popular until I would say about 10 years ago. The whole idea was Singapore was a growing new nation and it needed doctors and lawyers and engineers. And that's what all children were training to be a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer. About 10 years ago, they started art education programs in the school based upon the teacher drawing and the students copying. So it was still the old Chinese tradition. Then they started art appreciation, and I was involved with that for a while, where famous pieces of both Western and Asian art were taken into the classroom and explained to the students. And a lot of us were very unhappy with that approach. And we finally convinced the schools to start bringing school children to the museums. And there we can walk through and we can tell them stories and we can sit them on the floor and really have a wonderful time with them. The Scholars Gallery, for example, when I take children in there, they sort of look around and roll their eyes, but I start talking about status items. So like, what's a high status, gift or item for you? And they'll do, oh, cell phones, this or that branded shoes. And then you go, well, for these people, this was a status item. And they'll say, why? And then you can get talking about what makes an object of desire or a status item. And we have some artifacts that children love. We have a cheating handkerchief. All these scholars had to take state examinations to attain their rank in their offices. And it was very common, well, I wouldn't say very common, but it was somewhat common for people to cheat. And we have a large silk handkerchief, and it has 4 Confucian texts written on it in the tiniest calligraphy you could ever see. And that was a cheating handkerchief that someone would have stuffed up their sleeve and taken into one of their examination cells. And the students all go, ooh, when they see that. And then I say, so do any of you cheat? And they all quick look at their teacher. You can talk about the old systems of success and how you got a good job, and then the kids really warm up to the artifacts. And then they all, usually a couple at the end will say, I'm bringing my mom and dad back at the weekend. Or,
oh, that's great. That's great.
Great.
Well, I'll bring my kids too when I go next time. So we have one more question. I think we have time for just one more, which is, this is a question about the budget for the museum and how much is government and how much is private. How does the museum work in that sense?
Oh, I wish I knew that. That is very classified information, and
Okay.
you'll have to have our curator, or actually Kenny Ting, our CEO of the museum, come and talk to you one day. I'm sorry, I can't answer that.
Okay. Well, very good. I think we're almost at the hour now, and I just, on behalf of the Japan Center and the Asia Society generally, just want to thank you for all the time you put into this presentation, and we really appreciate your being able to do this. I think it's for our founders group and our the various other attendees, it's really a unique opportunity to experience a museum virtually, because it's very difficult for many of us to go there now. I hope I do get a chance to see the Scholars Gallery. And when I go there, I will know a lot more about it than I probably would have gotten just by wandering through.
Give me a call or drop me a line, and I'd be happy to take you through myself.
Okay, thank you so much. And I think everybody has your contact information if anybody wants to reach out to you afterwards.
Okay.
So with that, I think we will close for today. Again, with a virtual applause, and thank you so much, Patricia, for helping
Thank you.
us in meeting our group. And take care.
Okay.